Yes, it is an intangible asset, but what makes it unique is that it comes in the context of a business itself, and by definition, it's not separately identifiable or separable from the business. So it's essentially the value that's created or synergies created from the collection of assets of the business. So if you think about your tangible and intangible assets, working capital, equipment, brand, technology, people, by putting that all together to create a business, you create a value that's the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that delta between the whole and the sum of the parts is what's known as goodwill. So yes, it is intangible in nature, but it exists only because of the collection of assets that forms the business. In short, the value creation will vary, based on which intangible assets you're talking about. So, we talked about brands, a lot so far. There's really two main value drivers with brands that we've gotten into already. Foot traffic is the big one, and then pricing leverage is the other one. So, Raj previously talked about Coca-Cola. A good example, let's say you go into a grocery store that you haven't been to before, and you go to the soda aisle, and you see Coke on the shelf, and then you see the grocery store's private label cola right next to it, and the Coca-Cola one is more expensive. You look at the two and you pick Coca-Cola because you trust what's inside the packaging. You've had Coke before. You know how it's going to taste, and even though it's more expensive, you're willing to pay for that because it's a risk management tool at the same time. You could say the other one, it's cheaper because they're trying to win your business by pricing it lower, but it may not be as good. You haven't had it before, and like Raj said, that the brand is the promise of what it's going to be, and you don't know the other brand. It's a private label brand. It's a lower tier brand, so you don't know what their promise is. So you pick Coca-Cola because of that. So in that example right there, you picked Coke over the other product, and you paid more money for it on top of it, right? So that's where the brand can drive value. We could go. The other kind of main one is we talk about technology type assets too, patent portfolios or proprietary know-how, factors like that. Those will, often help you make a product that others can't make. That will give you pricing leverage, right? Or, if it's certain patents like a design patent or potentially utility patent, that can help you make something more cheaply as well. So you lower, rather than just giving you pricing leverage, you may be able to lower your input costs based on the proprietary technology that you have, things like that. And going off of what Christine was talking about with franchise rights or distribution agreements, a lot of that can go along with the foot traffic too, where you say I'm the only one that can sell XYZ product in this market, and others can't. So that's going to give me a certain level of demand. Some of those contractual agreements may have guaranteed minimums that come with it too. So that gives you good visibility into your business. But also risk management as well, saying there's a floor level of demand, for this based on our contractual agreement. So, those are the big ones. Value creation, will always come back to two things. It's going to come back to cash flow generation, greater cash flow generation, or lower risk. Either or both of those factors are going to lead to value creation at the end of the day. The tax benefits, there are tax benefits associated with these. To the Internal Revenue Code, if you acquire what's deemed to be an intangible asset, you get to amortize that over a 15-year life for tax purposes. So whenever we do intangible assets, we're capturing that value based on a 15-year amortization and and then an assumed tax rate and cost of capital as well, to say what's the present value of that 15-year tax savings. And that's all intangible assets. That even includes goodwill, even though it's not severable from the business. But brands, technology, contractual assets, goodwill, they all fall under the Internal Revenue Code, for tax benefits and tax amortization. And then your last question about the legal life. Yeah, this one will vary widely as well. Contracts would be, limited to the terms typically of the contract, and then, renewals that we may have to look at as well. Copyrights, for our intents and purposes are close to perpetuity. I mean, a copyright, expires 70 years after the death of the creator or the owner. So you could be talking about something with 100-year life, essentially, depending on who created it and when and their age and things like that. So those can be an extremely long time. The trickier ones come into patents. So most patents, especially on the utility side, where you have some type of invention, the legal life is 20 years from the application date, not from the approval date. So that is always the wild card, is when you submit a patent application to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office. It's then a 1 to 3 year timeline for them to review and approve the patent that you've submitted for. There are expedited filings you can pay for. You can pay a premium for, so you're closer to that 1 year time frame instead of the 3 year time frame. But still, it's not 20 years that you're able to really go out and use it and enforce it. It's something more in the 17 to 19 year time frame, and hopefully it's closer to 19. But it could be only 17 years based on the applications they have in the pipeline and their resources and such. So yeah, those are a couple of the main ones, and then trademarks. Those are typically just filing fees. You just, as long as you pay your annual filing fees, those can be maintained indefinitely. Yeah, there are. So within the greater valuation kind of spectrum, there's three ways of looking at any kind of valuation. Your kind of most basic is the cost approach, is what does it cost to recreate it. Second is your market approach, is has this type of asset traded in the marketplace, and what did it trade for, and then using those data points for whatever intangible assets you're talking about. And then lastly is the income approach, which is the most commonly used, where you're looking at the potential earnings power or income stream that's tied to the asset. Cost approach is rarely used, basically because the amount of the data and information required to do that not readily available, and you don't necessarily give full consideration for the value drivers of those intangible assets as well. So those usually don't get used. Market approach can be difficult too. I do a lot of IP valuation, and we're able to use the direct market approach in certain cases. But the problem is, especially if you talk about brands trading in the marketplace, it's often that it's not just the brands trade. Usually it's in the context of a business, or maybe other assets get included in the transaction, like certain inventory, or maybe specific equipment used to make the product, things like that. So that makes the the metrics a little bit more convoluted, and also just trying to find a transaction value and then underlying metrics for those those brands or patents as well aren't necessarily readily available in the marketplace. So, when we put together reports and show, exit strategy for our clients, we are often showing, transactions as evidence of a market, but we don't necessarily have the publicly available data to directly rely on those transactions. Essentially, you're trying to show liquidity for what some may view as sort of an illiquid asset. And so then lastly, what does that leave you with is your income approach. And the most common one that we've seen and used, that gets used in a wide variety of purposes, litigation, tax, financial reporting, is called the relief from royalty method, which is essentially saying, by owning whichever intangible asset, what royalties do I not have to pay out to a third party because I own, that intellectual property, the brand, the patent portfolio, what it may be. It's almost, kind of think of it like a hypothetical, sale leaseback transaction. If you were an IP licensing company, how would you view, buying a brand, right? You're going to buy it and then lease it back, to whichever company. What would your cash flow stream look like? That's kind of how we look at it. So you look at the sales of the business, and then you look at what the royalty rate, hypothetical royalty rate should be for that brand or patent portfolio, whatever the asset may be. And that comes from looking at the earnings power of it. We have a detailed brand scorecard that we use, to compare brands in the marketplace. And then we have extensive databases that we rely on for royalty rate agreements, some internal, some external. And by looking at all of that, then you're able to triangulate on what royalty rates really should be for these types of brands, patents, things like that. That converts your sales into a licensing stream, and it's essentially a discounted cash flow analysis from there. You tax affect the earnings and discount back to present value, and that gets you the value of the brand. Right? There's there are some other methods that are out there. Some of them have been stricken down by the courts in the past, but the most common one is relief from royalty, and then kind of like I said with the market approach or some others, you try to triangulate in or use other methods as a sanity check to kind of help corroborate on what you're coming up with from a total value. Yeah, as far as definitions of value and such go, I think a lot of it is steeped back in somewhat regulatory guidance or thought leadership that stems from the Financial Accounting Standards Board, the SEC, the IRS. I mean, we talk about valuation. I think people in the community know it goes back to 1959, to Revenue Ruling 5960, and what are really the factors that go into valuing a business and understanding competitive position and forecasting and management strength. Things like that. I think what it ultimately comes down to in the two main value standards of value are typically fair value, which is often either used in accounting or in shareholder disputes, or fair market value, which is been the longer used definition for tax or general advisory strategic planning, court cases, things like that. It's what would somebody pay for it, right? So, I have XYZ product that I paid $100 for it, but if someone's only going to pay me $20, they don't care that I paid $100. They care that they're going to pay $20, right? So it's what is the value add that would make somebody pay for that? That's really what's critical. It's not what you paid for it or what you did to build it. It's what somebody else would pay for. That's what something is ultimately worth. And that stems across the entire valuation spectrum. Is just what is the value to, like Megan alluded to, that kind of hypothetical buyer or you're that group of most likely buyers out there.